demographic crisis. Why am I talking about this? Well, it's become a topic of wider debate since Musk has been tweeting incessantly about it. But it's also something that is at the center of the explanation given for the falling rate of profit by David Zachariah and Cottrell Nye. So let's look at the raw data. Here we see the trajectory of total fertility. That is the number of children born on average to each woman during her lifetime in Britain from the 1930s to the present. And the sustainable limit is reckoned to be about 2.1. If you have 2.1 or above, the society is stable or growing. If you fall below a fertility rate of 2.1, it shrinks. It has to be slightly above 2 because of the proportion of people who die before they become reach childbearing age. Now, can you explain this? Was it the invention of the birth control pill that caused the current rate to be well below 2? Well, it's not a very good explanation because it became available in 1961 and the fertility rate continued to rise until the end of later in the 1960s anyway. So that's not a good explanation. But if you look at the period during which the birth rate was above 2, it corresponds to what the French call les 30 glorieuses, the 30 glorious years, when the economy was growing strongly, living standards were rising, and the vast majority of developed countries enjoyed a period of prosperity. That 30-year period of prosperity corresponds to the period that the birth rate was above reproduction levels. Important to note, it was below reproduction levels in the 1930s. Now, we can look at unemployment as an indicator of how prosperous society is. When the unemployment level is low, we can say it's a period of high prosperity. So how does unemployment do as an explanatory factor for the birth rate? If you correlate unemployment levels with total fertility from 1938 to now, you get a 61% correlation, minus 61% correlation. The negative correlation means that high levels of unemployment push down the fertility rate. If you look at the availability of contraception, it explains 30% of the change in fertility, the availability of the birth control pill. If you look at unemployment the year before and fertility the following year, you find that the correlation goes up to minus 65%. 2/3 of the decline is explained, or the variation is explained by variations in unemployment. And it's more sensible to take the year before, since deciding to have a child and actually having one takes around a year. Now, another factor to look at is house prices. High house prices will discourage people from having children. It's harder to start a family if you can't afford somewhere to live. So I've constructed a housing affordability index, which is based on dividing the average wage by the average house price. And I've scaled it by a factor of 10 so I can show them both on the same graph. Red is the affordability of housing, and you can see it has been declining. Blue is fertility. That I only have figures for the last 20 years, but the correlation is a 90% correlation over that period. Less affordable housing means fewer babies being born. Obviously, affordability is going down when house prices are increasing or rents are increasing. So far, the data indicates that the decline in the birth rate is primarily due to economic causes, with advances in birth control only explaining about a third of the decline. In the absence of economic causes, if unemployment was again as low as it was in the mid-1960s, and if housing was as affordable as it was then, we would expect the fertility rate now to be around 2.4. That is to say, slightly higher than you want for a stable long-term population. There's some reservations about this, obviously. I'm doing it all based on UK data, and I leave it up to viewers in other countries to apply it to their own country's statistics. Other factors you might look at are, what is the correlation between fertility and the rate of exploitation? What is the correlation between fertility and the rising share of the workforce going into higher education and thus ending in debt, up in debt for their education costs? High indebtedness is likely to discourage starting a family. Now, what are the consequences of this? What I'm saying is that neoliberal economics drive down the birth rate, and this has severe effects for capitalism. It implies, other things being equal, a declining workforce. If the workforce falls and the stock of capital, constant capital, remains unchanged, the organic composition, C over V, must rise, and that'll force down the rate of profit. And this could only be prevented by two things. One, allowing more immigration, or two, allowing the capital stock to run down, disaccumulate. Now we can see Japan was the first country to go through this. It has a very low birth rate, no immigration, and over 35 years or 40 years from 1965, the profit rate absolutely tumbled as a result of that. Now, other countries pursue immigration as a way out. The Conservative Party advocates of Brexit use the immigration issue as a reason to win votes in the Brexit referendum. But as soon as Brexit happened, the Conservative government actually greatly increased immigration. And if you look at immigration minus emigration, it rose from around 200,000 a year to over 800,000 a year under the last Tory government. It went up by a factor of 4. It's clear that the loyalty of the Conservative Party is to the demands of capital to have more cheap labour to exploit. It is not to the voters who had fallen for their promises on Brexit. But there's a political limit to this. By conceding to the demands of capital for cheap labour, the liberal bourgeoisie undermine their own political basis. They're undercut by right populist members of the bourgeoisie, like Trump and Farage. Now, the other factor is disaccumulation. Since this demographic crisis is general to the capitalist world, it's causing all the leading capitalist countries to see a decline in net investment. This graph is a few years old. It was included in my book, How the World Works. And it shows that net investment across the leading OECD countries has been declining. And for some countries, it was already negative between 2000 and 2010. And we can expect for more and more countries, the rate of accumulation will become negative. This has happened before. Capitalism is essentially recapitulating the trajectory of slave society, of the Roman Empire. Slave societies were unable to naturally reproduce their workforce due to the intensity of the exploitation of the slaves and the fact that slaves weren't allowed to marry. So Rome relied on importing slave labour. When this became difficult, due to them having reached the limits of their military expansion, the economy declined, and the massive infrastructure that had been built up by slave labour fell into decay, and this whole society collapsed into feudalism. The transition went as follows. Firstly, the slaves were replaced by what are called colonati, who were peasants who initially owned land but became increasingly dependent on the latifundis, or big landowners. From the 3rd century on, property owners were increasingly excluded from municipal administration, judiciary and tax systems. They were given exemptions. And this deepened the dependence of the colonati on the latifundios. It weakened the state structures. Tax collection, army recruitment, etc. were transferred to the latifundios run by the state machinery. And this increased the dependence of the colonati. And Constantine's constitution explicitly bound the colonati to their farms, prohibiting them from leaving without the property owner's consent. So this caste of colonati were being transformed into the serfs. Despite this, feudalism actually solved problems, because the serfs were allowed to marry. They had immediate control of the land they cultivated, even though they paid rent, which gave them an incentive to farm it efficiently. And they were subject to a lower rate of exploitation than chattel slaves. They therefore had more children, and the population could be self-sustaining and even slowly grow. Also, the elimination of slavery encouraged the use of water power, because there's a huge disincentive in a slave economy to using any machinery, because slaves are so cheap as a way of, muscle power was cheap. And this allowed the redevelopment of civilization on a new social and technical basis. Now, is there any comparable improvement now? We know that prosperity, good prospects for your children, full employment, cheap education, all raised birth rates during the 30 glorious years. And we also have another example that East Germany was able to reverse the decline in birth rates that was general to the whole of Germany when in the 1970s they introduced social reforms like free kindergartens, priority in public housing for single mothers, benefits for mothers, etc. So the conclusion is the demographic crisis can't be separated from crises in the production relations, and only a transformation of production relations can solve them.